We would like to welcome you all to the 19th edition of the Anonymous Meeting webinar series. My name is Prashant Udrani, conference producer for AIM, and I'll be your MC for today. The Anonymous Meeting is the largest investment platform in the world, an initiative of the UAE Ministry of Economy. AIM has been promoting a healthier global economy by linking investment opportunities to fast-growing economies under 6 key pillars: foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment, small and medium enterprise, startups, and future cities, with a special event, One Belt, One Road. We would like to thank our multilateral partner, Islamic Cooperation for the Development of the Private Sector, for sponsoring today's webinar. There's a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you experience any issue with your audio or video during the webinar, just refresh your browser and that should take care of everything. We would suggest you using Chrome, Firefox, or Opera. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the question box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If the question is addressed to a particular speaker, please do mention their name at the start of the question. If you like a specific question, vote for it under the question tab so we can address it to our speakers. In the panel discussion today, we will cover the topic, strengthening the global partnership in international trade during pandemic crisis. Our speakers will be discussing the steps countries are taking to ensure free flow of trade, building a resilient supply chain, and developing policies to strengthen cooperation between multinational and MSMEs. I would now like to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Ms. Courtney Finger. Ms. Courtney is the editorial-in-chief FDI at NS Media Group, a UK-based publisher in New Statements magazine and industry-leading business-to-business titles powered by innovative data and technology platforms. She heads the group's coverage of cross-border investment. Before joining in 2020, Ms. Finger spent 15 years in Financial Times, where she was the editor-in-chief of FDI magazine and the head of content in Associate Data Division, FDI Intelligence, as well as contributing as the writer in FD newspaper. She'll be joined by a panel of experts. Courtney, I would request you to please take it from here.
Hello, and thank you very much for the opportunity to lead this discussion. I personally can't wait to hear what our esteemed panelists have to say. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a massive disruption to the global economy and to world trade. And this comes against the backdrop of some slightly rocky years in any case for the global trading system. And my topic that I focus on is foreign direct investment, but of course, trade and investment go hand in hand. So disruptions to global trade flows have a huge impact on foreign direct investment and also on economic development worldwide. So we'll try to unpack this a little bit and find out the state of play as it stands right now, what recovery might look like, and what strategies could and should be pursued at the national level, and what support could be found from multilateral organizations. Now, if you've seen our slate of speakers, which you'll see on the screen there now, they are perfectly well placed to talk this through with us, and we are grateful for their time, especially at such a delicate time for national and global economies. Let me introduce them to you right now. We have the Honorable Soraya Hakuziyaremye, Minister of Trade and Industry of Rwanda, with apologies if I've not said your surname quite accurately. I have tried. We have Ambassador Alan Wolf, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. And joining us in a few minutes will also be Honorable Naveen Gamia, Minister of Trade and Industry of Egypt. Welcome to both of you, and thank you again for your time. Oh, I see that we have with us Minister Gamia. Welcome to all of you. And I think to set the stage for a very relevant discussion, because in the former Rwanda and Egypt, we have two very important developing countries, and hopefully you'll be able to tell us what you are doing at the governmental level to help cope with the uncertainty that COVID-19 has unleashed. And if we can just start our discussion, I'd like to turn first to our two honorable ministers. When we think about this disruption that we've seen to global trade and to the world economy, what are the implications for national economies such as those that you are helping to lead, and how can governments best react? If we can hear first from Minister Gamia. Yes, hello, Minister.
This question is for the Minister of Meeting, am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
بالنسبة لأزمة فيروس كورونا المستجدة التي تعرض لها العالم كله، يعتبر أزمة غير مسبوقة ولم تكن هناك أزمات سابقة مشابهة للقياس. يشترك العالم أجمع في الخطوط العريضة لهذه التداعيات الاقتصادية والاجتماعية لهذه الأزمة، ولكن دعونا نتفق أن لكل دولة خصوصياتها في درجة تأثرها وفقا للمعطيات الاقتصادية ومدى قدرتها على تحمل تلك الأزمة.
The whole world was affected by the pandemic crisis. It is unprecedented crisis, and there was no similar case to compare or measure upon. The outline of the economic and social impact of this pandemic is common in most of the countries, but each has its own case of vulnerability according to its economic givings and its own ability to bear the crisis and its consequences.
بالطبع أدت الأزمة إلى اضطرابات في التجارة الدولية وسلاسل التوريد العالمية نظرا لحدوث صدمة من جانب العرض والطلب العالمي في وقت واحد. فيما يخص وزارة التجارة والصناعة المصرية، تعد أحد انعكاسات تداعيات هذه الأزمة على المستوى المحلي تأثيرها على الصناعات التحويلية بكافة أشكالها، لأن الصناعة المصرية مرتبطة بسلاسل التوريد العالمية ولديها علاقات ترابطية أمامية وخلفية مع مختلف دول العالم.
Of course, this crisis had led to a disruption in the international trade and the global supply chain as a reason for the shock in both supply and demand side at once. And regarding the Egyptian Ministry of Trade and Industry, the most highlighted implication on the national level is the effect on the transformational industries in all its forms, as the Egyptian industry has forward and backward relations with the global supply chain.
وقد انعكس هذا الأمر على تحقيق انخفاض كبير بنسبة 24% في حجم الواردات السلعية غير البترولية لمصر خلال ال5 شهور الأولى من هذا العام، والتي بلغت 23 مليار دولار مقابل 30 مليار دولار خلال نفس الفترة من العام الماضي، فضلا عن تراجع العجز في الميزان التجاري لمصر بقيمة 7.2 مليار دولار وبنسبة تراجع 24% عن نفس الفترة من العام الماضي، وهو ما يؤكد نجاح خطة الوزارة في زيادة الاعتماد على المنتج الوطني وإحلال الواردات بمنتجات محلية الصنع.
All this reflected on realizing a significant reduction of 24% in non-petroleum imports of Egypt in the first 5 months of this year, 2020, reaching $23 billion compared to $30 billion in the same period of last year. In addition to the fallback by 24% in the deficit of the trade balance to reach $7.2 billion, which reflects the success of the ministry's strategy to further enhance the local industry and imports replacement with national products.
وفي ضوء حرص الحكومة المصرية على استمرار عجلة الإنتاج والاستثمار والحد من تأثر مستويات العرض والطلب الداخلي، فإن مصر لم تتخذ إجراءات عنيفة لمواجهة الأزمة بالمقارنة بالعديد من الدول. تم فرض حظر تجوال جزئي، ولكن تم استثناء الأنشطة الصناعية منه، وكانت الحكومة تضع نصب عينيها على استمرار عجلة الإنتاج والحفاظ على وتيرة عمل الصناعة المصرية، وفي الوقت نفسه حماية العمالة من الإصابة بالفيروس. واتخذت الحكومة بعض القرارات التي خدمت بشكل كبير قطاع الصناعة والتصدير.
In light of the attention of the Egyptian government to keep the wheel of production and investments ongoing and to mitigate the effect on the local levels of supply and demand, Egypt has not taken severe measures of lockdown unlike other countries, as the lockdown in Egypt was partial and the industrial activities was exempted from this lockdown. In order to maintain the production levels in line with taking the protective measures to protect the workers and labor, the government also took important decisions to serve the industrial and export sector.
من هذه الإجراءات توحيد وخفض سعر الغاز الطبيعي للصناعة ل $4.5 لكل مليون وحدة حرارية، قرار بتخفيض أسعار بيع الطاقة الكهربائية الموردة للأنشطة الصناعية على الجهود الفائقة والعالية والمتوسطة، تأجيل سداد الضريبة العقارية المستحقة على المصانع لمدة 3 شهور، إطلاق مبادرة المصانع المتعثرة والتي تسري على المصانع المتعثرة حتى 30/6/2020، ومن أهدافها إسقاط فوائد متراكمة تبلغ 31 مليار عن 5148 مصنع متعثر. إصدار قرار بمد العمل بالرخص والسجلات الصناعية المنتهية لمدة مناسبة، تشكيل لجنة من الأجهزة المعنية بالوزارة لإجراء حملات تفتيشية لمتابعة التزام المصانع بتطبيق الإجراءات الاحترازية حفاظا على سلامة العمال، متابعة التزام القطاع الخاص بالحفاظ على العمالة وعدم تسريحها وعدم المساس بأجورهم.
For examples for the decisions that the government take during the last period, during the crisis, unifying and lowering the gas price to $4.5 per million thermal unit, lowering the prices of selling the electric power to the industrial activities for the higher medium voltages, delaying the payment of the real estate tax of the industrial factors for 3 months, also launching an initiative to support 5,148 defaulted factories till the 30th of June 2020 through dropping accumulated interest of amount of a value of 31 billion Egyptian pound. In addition to extending the expiry date of industrial licenses till the end of May 2020, forming a committee of the related affiliates in the ministry to inspect on executing the protective measures in the factories. Finally, following up on the commitment of the private sector to keep the labor with no layoffs and keeping the payment of their wages.
Thank you very much for that, Honorable Minister. Now I'll ask if we can hear what's going on in Rwanda, what measures are being pursued by your government there to help offset these disruptions. And maybe perhaps also, Honorable Minister, you can help place it in an African perspective as well, and what is the impact of the crisis on Africa and then on your particular country?
Thank you for having me. I think for the way we have tackled, be it at regional, national level, the pandemic, of course, this has been an unprecedented crisis in that we've had both a combination of supply and demand shocks caused by the pandemic. Rwanda in particular has been among the first countries in Africa to impose a total lockdown, which we imposed 1 week after the first positive case was recorded on 14th of March. That, of course, had an impact on domestic trade, although we continue to allow trade of essential goods. And the limited economic activity, coupled with the lockdown in our main export markets, clearly impacted demand for our products. And in addition, most of the equipment and intermediary goods that are used by our industries are imported from Asia and Europe primarily. And hence the COVID-19 spread on both continents disrupted our supply as early as February onwards. And our economy, which had been growing at an average of 8% annually for the past 15 years, is now set to only grow by 2%. We won't have a recession, but that is a reduction from the 9.6% GDP growth we had last year. As far as trade is concerned, first of all, we worked with our partners within the East African community to quickly set guidelines that would facilitate movement of goods throughout the pandemic. Nevertheless, there were challenges around preventive measures for transporters and their crew, which had an impact on cross-border trade as countries devised harmonized way to allow free movement of goods while protecting our citizens against COVID-19. And at the national level, the constant dialogue between the government of Rwanda and our private sector has been key to avoid shortages in essential goods, be it food commodities, sanitation products, or medicine. We also put in place mechanism to limit price hikes and hoarding of essential goods with fixed retail prices during the lockdown and afterwards, mainly on food items and other essential products, because we thought it was essential to us as a country to ensure that also consumers are protected against speculators during the pandemic as we navigate through the economic and social crisis that it entails. And beyond the immediate responses, we have set as a government an economic recovery strategy, which includes an economic recovery fund of $200 million to support our industries and SMEs. And we believe that going forward, recovery strategies will also include, be it at national but also at continental level, a strong structural component to develop further local manufacturing, develop more value-adding, knowledge-intensive sectors, and also, have a more competitive and efficient services sector. So we had started already at our level in Rwanda to really implement a Made in Rwanda policy, working on specific sectors where we thought we had a comparative advantage, but also ensure that we have enough local production for some essential products, be it in agro-processing and construction materials, which we now have to strengthen those sectors, not only building the productive capacities, but also strengthening our domestic value chains and advancing digital trade, which we have seen really not only grew, but is a sector that we need to invest more in, not only at national level, but also continentally, especially as the continent works on implementing and operationalizing the Continental Free Trade Area, which we now know will enter into force in January 2021. But I think this is something that will also be a game changer, not only for the continent, but as we see this pandemic is with us for a few more months. We don't know where any vaccine will be there. So this is, integration at regional and continental level is also something that we need to work on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you touch on a number of themes that I know countries worldwide are grappling with, such as bolstering local supply chains, supporting local manufacturing, protecting progress that was made in terms of economic growth at such a challenging time. Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to turn to Ambassador Wolf. You will obviously have an eagle-eye view on the global situation in relation to disruptions to trade. What do you see as the major implications of all of this, Ambassador Wolf, and what might recovery look like?
Thank you very much. It's very good to be with you and very good to be with the two ministers. We have 164 members, and of course the first responses were national. They were necessarily national because the first thing to do would be to assure that supplies of medical equipment are available and that food is available, although global food supplies are in reasonably good shape, very high stocks and good crops coming in. At the WTO, what we did was to collect information on trade measures that were imposed and make that information available to members, as well as to estimate what the effects would be so that national governments could make their plans knowing what the world looked like. And the answer is that the estimate was trade would fall off this year by 13 to 32% was the prediction. It's quite a wide range, but that's because we don't know whether there'll be a second wave. There's in the last 250 years, there have been 10 pandemics. There's always been a second wave. In 1918, there were 3 waves. The second was the greatest in terms of impact. So we forecast recovery in 2021, and it looks good for getting to a recovery. How sharp will it be? That depends on whether businesses can start up readily again. It's a collection of global phenomena, and we look forward to a reasonable rebound. A lot will depend on when vaccines are available so that total opening doesn't result in a second wave that's very difficult to deal with, or even a third wave. That no one knows about when there'll be availability, but the epidemiologists suggest that we might have some vaccines in the fall and might have, at least by year end, more availability. which would be a godsend. The members are proposing a number of measures to deal with the pandemic. That there could be notification given and taking into account the effects on others of any export controls. That there could be a sunset provision so that measures that go into effect would be removed at a specific time. That there'd be a rollback of measures. Already in the case of food restrictions, there's been a substantial rollback of the initial export restrictions that went into effect. But there's room for a good deal of cooperation, and there have been proposals led by Singapore and New Zealand, led by Canada on behalf of 49 members of the WTO with respect to food, availability of food, and export restrictions that might affect food. Korea has come in with some strong suggestions. So there's a very active element of discussion of how to deal with this pandemic and how do we deal with future crises of this sort, because this may not be the last event of this kind. And then we can get into it in a bit, but how do we foster the recovery, which is the next phase? And the ministers have talked about what national measures could be applied, and the question is what could be done cooperatively at the level of the WTO. And that's the subject for current discussion. There could be tariff liberalization, for example. There could be trade facilitation. With respect to Africa, to the extent that Africa wishes it, the WTO could work collectively to make the African Continental Free Trade Agreement really effective. There is a lower level of intra-country trade within intra-continental trade in Africa than in most regions of the world. And the AFCFTA is designed to deal with that. To the extent that the WTO can be of assistance, we should do so. So we're beginning to come to grips with how we can aid the recovery, and lowering the cost of moving something from one country to another is really the major objective.
Thank you very much for that. And you mentioned, Ambassador Wolf has mentioned the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and I've seen that we've had a question come in from the audience surrounding that as well. So I wonder, Honorable Minister, would you address the issue of intra-African trade and intra-regional trade? Is there more to be done to facilitate that? And to what extent could intra-regional trade help assist the recovery from your perspective? Honorable Minister from Rwanda, would you like to address this question?
Thank you, Courtney. I think that, the pandemic started where we were in the middle of negotiations to really start, the operationalization, as I mentioned, of the Continental Free Trade Area, finalizing negotiations around tariffs, rules of origin, especially for goods, and services would also be the second phase. And this pandemic, what it has shown is how vulnerable our economies are if we don't increase be it intra-regional trade, especially as we've seen, for instance, disruption in being air travels, but also, in the supply chain, in the logistics, meaning that your neighbors are your most important markets, but more so during this pandemic. and having coordinated approaches on one, how we trade with each other, but also developing, being the infrastructure that's needed for that trade, intra-African trade to continue, the products that are available, because before we can trade freely, we must have quality products that we can trade with each other, and those issues I believe now are taking prominence, and as we finalize the negotiations to really start trading among ourselves. The aim of the African Continental Free Trade Area was to ensure that intra-African trade can double within the first 5 years. It's now at a very low level of 16 to 17%, where you compare to Asia, where intra-Asian trade is at 63%, Europe similarly. So we could see that really our African countries, are trading more with the world than within ourselves, with the consequences that over-reliance on other continents has had on our economies, as we mentioned, be it on the exports, but also on the imports of materials that we use in our industries or other equipment and machineries.
Thank you very much. And we have had a few questions come in about policy in Egypt, so I would like to share their questions. One surrounds the importance of online business and digital trade is perhaps more important than ever. What is Egyptian policy with regards to supporting online businesses and e-commerce?
بالنسبة للتجارة الإلكترونية ومدى أهميتها، طبعا لا شك أن لها أهمية قصوى في زيادة العلاقات التجارية ما بين الدول، ولكن ازدادت أهميتها في أزمة كوفيد-19 نظرا للإجراءات اتخذتها جميع الدول، فيتم الاستبدال عن اللقاء المباشر والانتقال بشكل مباشر عن طريق التفاعل الإلكتروني.
Yes, we agree that the online, the e-commerce is becoming very important, especially during this crisis, due to the lockdown, and that there is no physical interaction between people from different countries.
حريصين على ان احنا يبقى يتواجد لدينا بلاتفورم للتجاره الالكترونيه، سواء طبعا فيما يخص المنتجات المحليه، ولكن نجاحها هيكون في التواصل مع الدول الاخرى، واحنا في سبيلنا لانشاء او اطلاق للتعاون لاطلاق منصه تجاره الكترونيه افريقيه، بما ان احنا بالنسبه لنا السوق الافريقي من الاسواق الواعده.
We are taking very specific measure regarding launching different platforms of e-commerce on the national level, and we are planning that those platforms will extend internationally. This is going to be in addition to the launching of the African e-commerce platform that is under process.
وبنعتبر التجاره الالكترونيه من افضل المجالات اللي ممكن احنا كحكومه وكدوله ان احنا نبتدي فيها، وخاصه فيما يخص مجال اصحاب الانتربرنور والمشروعات الصغيره.
We consider that supporting the small businesses and the entrepreneurs during this period through enabling them with the tools of the e-commerce, we consider this as one of our top priorities.
فالتجاره الالكترونيه تاخذ من الحكومه قدر كبير من الاهتمام، واحنا في سبيلنا الى الانتهاء من عده مبادرات لاطلاق اكثر من منصه الكترونيه، ولكن حرصنا التواصل مع القاره الافريقيه او الدول الافريقيه، وممكن نفتح مجالات للتعاون مع الدول الاوروبيه والدول التي لدينا تفعيل الاتفاقات التجاريه فيما بيننا وبينها.
As I mentioned, that the e-commerce topic is one of our top priorities.
and we are processing and launching e-commerce platforms in different sectors. But also we are committing to communicate with the countries in the African continent regarding this topic, and also the European continent, and all our international trade partners within the trade agreements signed with them.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll turn to another excellent question that's come in for the audience. And thank you, by the way, to the audience for being so active in asking questions. The question is, as countries are moving towards localization, perhaps at the expense of globalization, do you think this might create a new form of trade? And I'd like to ask this to Ambassador Wolf.
Thank you. There will be some onshoring with respect to medical equipment. At least that is the stated intent of a number of countries. Medical supplies, probably with respect to items such as personal protective equipment and masks, that sort of thing. Countries will want to maintain either supplies or diversify their sources, their foreign sources. That's what the pandemic has pointed out. But I don't anticipate a great deal of onshoring because economics intervenes. Countries everywhere are going to be short of revenue. They've spent a lot of money, quite correctly, on fiscal measures to counter the downturn that has been caused by the pandemic. I don't think there's going to be a lot of money that is freely available for subsidies going forward. But there has been a lot of government intervention to date. So getting any distortions of trade back out of the system will be a concern of the members of the WTO. But I don't anticipate a wave of protectionism. I think that outside of the medical equipment, to some degree, maybe the pharmaceutical area, when there are some countries able to produce supplies, but stocking can take care of having a domestic supply for some things. And as I say, diversification of supplies will take care of a lot of the immediate problems. But the end of global supply chains, I don't see it. Companies have to make a profit. And there's going to be a limit to the ability to say, well, we'll produce everything every place. As the ministers have just said, the digital economy is spurring increased globalization. There can be contributions from any country to any other country in terms of businesses moving across borders digitally. And I think we're just going to see more and more of that. So globalization isn't ended. I don't think it's even going to be paused. But countries have to be able to participate. That means more targeted assistance for developing countries and getting smarter about the technical assistance that's given, as well as the financial assistance. And I think that'll be the next phase.
Thank you very much. And when we think about supply chains, one of the urgent products, of course, would be the food supply chain. And we've heard mention already about that. Well, first of all, question for Ambassador Wolf, is this something, does the WTO, and this is a question that's coming from the audience, are there any forecasts by the WTO as relates to potential food shortages or issues with global food supply chains as a result of the disruption? And then I'd like to ask both ministers as well what you are doing at the national level to help ward against any major disruptions to your domestic food supply chains.
Thank you. Global supplies are very robust. They're at one of the top 3 levels since data has been collected. And stocks are very good. That said, there can be local problems. And there has to be an awareness of what the supplies look like. Food is obviously essential. and it has to be available and at a reasonable price, affordable prices. So there were price spikes in the during the financial crisis that caused some major problems for particularly developing countries, some developing countries. We don't anticipate a repeat of that as a general matter, but there can be local problems. And with the lifting of some of the restrictions on labor, but they haven't been complete, there will be some local problems because, for example, palm oil in Malaysia depends upon harvesting by people who are across the border. If the border is closed because of the pandemic, then there's a problem with the harvest. So there will be some local problems still because of the pandemic. But generally speaking, food supplies are very good.
Thank you. And can we hear how much of an issue is this for Rwanda? Is this something that concerns you, Honorable Minister? And what is the government doing to make sure that food supply chains for your domestic consumption are protected at this time?
So for Rwanda, the fact that we had a substantial growth of our agriculture sector means that actually, food supply is not something that we were worried more about, meaning that most of the food commodities that are consumed locally are also produced locally. Where we had to really make an effort was to make sure that the logistics of it and the distribution across the country can move smoothly, especially during the lockdown and even afterwards. And we continue to really invest massively in food security, in agriculture, and this is a sector that employs almost 70% of our population. So to what Ambassador Wolf was mentioning on the labor issue, that we don't have an issue because it's local workforce and the most consumed food commodities are also produced locally. As far as some of the inputs that we have in food, which I would look at rice, which complements our local production, or even sugar. What we have really been able to do is to have our importers have alternative markets so that we're not dependent to a single source of supply. And the fact that be it regionally, but also the supply chains from the countries we import from have now sort of resumed, I wouldn't say to the normal levels. So this is something that we also continue to monitor for imports that are coming in the country, but most of the food consumed locally is produced locally. So it's really making sure that our agriculture sector continues to grow and that we facilitate our farmers in having access to, let's say, fertilizers, irrigation projects continue as planned. But it's something that we were lucky to have had really this important development and growth in agriculture sector to ensure our food security. I think you're on mute, Courtney. Yeah, good.
Thank you. Let's hear about the plans in Egypt to protect your food security.
فيما يخص الأزمة اللي العالم بيعيشها حاليا، بيصبح توفير المخزون اللازم للمواد الاستهلاكية الأساسية مسألة أمن قومي. ولذلك في بداية الأزمة اتخذت الوزارة عددا من القرارات اللي خدمت هذه الأهداف، كان من أهمها إيقاف تصدير بعض أصناف البقوليات لمدة 3 شهور وأشياء أخرى. ولكن الدور الفعال لمصر على المستوى الدولي ووفاء لتعاقدات تجارية بين الشركات المصرية ونظيراتها في الخارج. على هذا الجانب تم إتاحة تصدير برضو بعض الكميات من السلع الغذائية للدول المتضررة من فيروس كورونا.
Since the start of the crisis, a higher demand and pressure on the medical equipment has risen as an essential need for the society. and securing the sufficient stocks of the essential consumer goods and medical equipment became a matter of national security. In that regard, the Ministry of Trade and Industry took some necessary decrees, such as issuance of a ministerial decree banning the export of legumes for 3 months. But in light of the effective role of Egypt on the international level and enforcing the contracts of the Egyptian companies with their international partners, we authorized the export of large quantities of medical and food supplies to many countries affected by the pandemic.
بالإضافة لهذا احنا نعتبر من الدول اللي بسبب هذه الجائحة حجم صادراتنا وخاصة من الحاصلات الزراعية حصل فيها كثير من النمو والازدياد. من هذا المنطلق أؤكد أن أغلب احتياجاتنا من السلع والمنتجات الغذائية والحاصلات الزراعية آمنة، وكل ده بينطبق على لدينا مخزون متوافر وآمن بيكفي جميع احتياجاتنا.
I would like to highlight also that during the pandemic, there was a rise in the Egyptian exports of the agricultural goods, and in that regard, also I would assure that most of our needs of food and agricultural products are secured, together with the medical equipment that are available in sufficient quantities, stocks, except those equipment that are not made in Egypt.
حريصين كل الحرص مش مجرد الاطمئنان على احتياجاتنا من المستلزمات الغذائيه، ولكن على الجانب الاخر هناك قطاع مهم استحوذ على اهتمام الحكومه المصريه، وهو المستلزمات الطبيه ومدى توافر احتياجاتنا سواء من المنتج المحلي او ان احنا لنا القدره على اتاحه التصدير لبعض المنتجات لبعض الدول المتضرره من جائحه كورونا.
The food supplies and the agricultural products was not the only our first concern, but also the medical equipment was one of the top priorities, and securing the sufficient quantities of these equipment, but not only this, and also exporting them to the countries that are affected by the pandemic.
Thank you very much. And questions come in that is relates specifically to Rwanda, but I think is probably also touches on a broader point, and that is the fact of the pandemic requiring expansionary fiscal policy interventions from governments in order to cope with it. And I would sort of interject my own question is, how do we avoid big deficits and a future debt problem as a result of the measures needed to stabilize things for the moment? The question regarding Rwanda that's come in is, what is the government debt to GDP ratio of the country currently? And what would the impact be of mitigation measures on the Rwanda fiscal situation?
That is a valid question, as we've seen many governments, having to expand their expenses, especially as far as acquiring medical equipment, supporting the health sector as well. And Rwanda was not an exception. However, we've really managed to have our debt to GDP ratio below the 50% that the IMF requires that we don't go over. Pre-COVID, we were at about 32 to 34% of debt to GDP ratio. Now it has increased a little bit, but I believe I have to cross-check the numbers again because I know the budget is going to Parliament this week. But we will still below 40%. We still have a margin, although we know that the fiscal revenues also are going to be much lower this year, which implies that the budget is allocated, of course, to the priority sector being health, but also the support to our economy. We will suffer a reduction of our domestic revenue, but as I mentioned, although we won't have a GDP growth as we were used to, we will still have a 2% GDP growth. And we're hoping that by 2022 we can go back to the 8%, 9% growth that we were targeting. So we're not yet worried about our debt ratio for now, and we continue to monitor also the domestic sources of revenue as well from 2021 onwards.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for the continued questions that are streaming in. It's really great to have the input from the audience. One question I've just seen that is something I wanted to ask in any case is about the Sustainable Development Goals. This, of course, is very important metrics that were being worked towards, and a lot of hard work in developing countries to help keep these on track. Does the crisis threaten the achievement of some of the Sustainable Development Goals? I'll ask both ministers that, but first I'd like to ask Ambassador Wolf how you see that situation, and how can the global trading environment actually and its recovery help assist the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? Is there a link in your mind?
I think, the Sustainable Development Goals are a long-term effort to which all the countries of the WTO and all the countries of the United Nations have subscribed. The major negotiation that is directly called for under the 14th of the Sustainable Development Goals is regulation of fishery subsidies, and that negotiation is continuing. It paused during the closure of the WTO building because a number of countries, members, felt that it was impossible to really negotiate the way we're doing now over the web, that it had to be in person. But the building is now reopened. There are ambassadors, representatives of the member countries can come in, and that negotiation will continue. So that's the most concrete of the Sustainable Development Goals. With respect to food security, the Agriculture Committee and the Agriculture Committee in special session are looking into the subject of what rules should exist for food security. I might say that when I talked about the availability of food, what I left out is the ability to pay for food. A lot of, for those countries that are net importers, they are not necessarily in a good position with respect to their earnings from exports, because exports have been curbed during the downturn. So there's a need for fiscal recovery, foreign exchange reserves sufficient to when countries are net importers to import. And there's been a falling off of exports that, for example, specialty crops from Africa that went to Europe went in the cargo holds of passenger jets. Commercial aviation ceased very largely during the pandemic, so that has to recover. And export earnings for commodities have fallen off dramatically. For example, for cotton, because factories shut around the world that would have used the cotton, and therefore prices are very depressed for those countries, particularly in West Africa with respect to cotton, that were very dependent on that crop. So there are a series of problems, but long term, the Sustainable Development Goals remain very important to us, and progress will be made. And I think the pandemic interferes with, in the short term, the ability to pursue these goals. But I don't see countries abandoning them or turning aside from them for the longer term. And on fish subsidies, fishery subsidies, that negotiation is commencing once again.
Thank you very much. And we have just a few minutes left, but I would like to ask how Egypt's progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals might be impacted.
فيما يخص أهداف التنمية المستدامة، مصر كدولة بتنتهج مسار اقتصادي متميز، بالإضافة لقيامنا في الفترة الماضية بالعديد من الإصلاحات الاقتصادية، واللي كان ليها أهم أثرها الحفاظ على أهداف التنمية المستدامة. ولولا يعني دخولنا في هذا المجال وقيامنا بالعديد من هذه الإصلاحات ودراسة منهجية التنمية المستدامة، ما كانتش الدولة هتقدر تواجه أزمة كورونا 19.
The Egyptian government has adopted an approach of exceptional rearrangements and corrections in the economy, and that was aligned with the goals of the sustainable development goals, and and this actually put Egypt in a position to be able to overcome the implication and the circumstances of the coronavirus pandemic, of the current crisis.
بالإضافة لأن احنا حرصنا للتعميق والتنمية فيما يخص أهداف التنمية المستدامة، لأن هي تمسنا كدولة، وبيكون ليها الأثر دايما الجيد على المجتمع وفئات المجتمع المختلفة، وخاصة فيما يخص توفير احتياجاتهم، وفي نفس الوقت توفير فرص العمل، وهو شيء الحكومة حريصة عليه في ظل كما تعلمون عدد الدولة المصرية يتجاوز 100 مليون مواطن.
The Egyptian government gave an attention to develop and to deepen the procedures that are aligned with the goals of the sustainable development goals, as those goals has a direct and effective reflection on the society, and increasing the opportunities for the people, and satisfying their needs. Especially that the population of Egypt has exceeded 100 million people, and this actually is really important for the job creation for the more than 100 million Egyptians.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we've got just a minute or two left, but I do want to hear about Rwanda's status as relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, and how can these be kept on track despite the challenging environment?
I think as Minister Naveen said, or Ambassador Wolf, the SDGs being a long-term, these are long-term objectives and goals to reach. But it's true that we've seen that, the pandemic has sort of not only delayed some of the strategies, but could also risk to put some of the SDGs, on the back of our minds. And I'm thinking, for instance, here on, if we look at the development of private sector, but also the role of women and youth in the businesses, and how we make sure that all the policies and strategies that we're taking for the recovery of our economies are as inclusive as we had targeted. For Rwanda, being on the health sector, or the development goals related to, let's say, gender promotion or inclusion, we were, I think, ahead of many of the development goals, and we continue to make sure that, regardless of the pandemic, some of the policies and strategies in place that will help us reach the SDGs do not fall behind. But this is, I think, we still have 10 years to go, and hoping that we don't have any further pandemic. But this is, if I can add on, I think it's a novel experience for all countries, as not only we chart our new economies, what will be the driving sectors going forward, But for Rwanda and many African countries, it's making sure that we also protect our health sectors and with the gaps and challenges that we have. So it's we're happy to note that in Rwanda, at least, although lockdown measures for our economy had an impact, and it's really a sacrifice from some of the businesses, but that also the citizens have understood that the priority should be preserving the health of our citizens, and then work on the recovery of the economic sectors going forward.
Thank you very much, and we will start to wrap up now. There's so many important topics wrapped up in all of this that we could spend a long time discussing, but I hope at least we've touched on many of the crucial ones. I want to say thank you, of course, to the valuable time of our three panelists. I know you have a lot of pressing priorities at this moment, so we appreciate you taking a moment to share your experiences and your insights. I guess in terms of takeaways, it's obvious that there are no easy solutions, no easy ways out of this difficult time, but it will all rest on cooperation, and as has been highlighted in the various comments of our speakers, and the cooperation will exist on many levels between national governments, so between countries, between regions, between the public sector and the private sector, and between national governments and economies and multilateral institutions. A lot of work still to be done, but I hope that if we convene again this time next year, we are talking about how we have recovered and growth for the future. I want to say a big thank you to all of those who tuned in for this webinar. I see from the chats that we have a very international audience, people reporting in from all around the world, and that's great to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister and Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Courtney. Thank you to our ministers, and thank you, Ambassador Wolf, for joining us today and for taking the time out from your schedule and sharing your thoughts and perspectives with us. I would like to thank once again our multilateral partner, Islamic Cooperation for the Development of the Private Sector, for sponsoring today's webinar. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us and for sharing their questions. The link to today's webinar video will be sent to you via email. We are also conducting a short survey to get your feedback on today's webinar. The link to the survey will be shared to you via chat and via email. To register for our next webinar, which is scheduled for the 29th of June 2020, please visit our website, www.aimcongress.com/webinars. Also follow us on our social media channels to keep yourself updated. Thank you all once again. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us and for sharing your views with us. Thank you.